this first edition of a new series of Captains of Industry, we bring you Miguel Azevedo, Dubai-based banker and Afro-optimist. He spent a lifetime in investment banking and was involved in some of the biggest deals in the African financial world, including advising the Access Bank and Diamond Bank merger in Nigeria. He has roots on the continent and very strong views on investment here and how the continent should run its economies. We caught up with him at the World Economic Forum in Cape Town. Well, welcome to the Cullinan Hotel in Cape Town for our next edition of Captains of Industry. Now, with me I've got Miguel Azevedo. He's the head of Citi, an operation that has operations across the continent and also has a base in Dubai. But thank you very much for joining us.
My pleasure.
And just to tell me, what is your connection with Africa?
So from a professional standpoint, I've started covering Africa for 6 years now, but Citi as a whole has been in Africa, I think in certain countries for more than 100 years actually. But in all of those 16 countries where we have operations, we've been for more than 25 years. So Citi is very, very much involved in Africa for a long time. And I believe I'm right when I'm saying it's the only global bank with such a presence in the continent.
And what is your background a little bit? I mean, I'm always a good way to assess sometimes business people is to see where they come from and what the influences were in their life. What about you?
And I think rightly so, because that ends up impacting very seriously the interest and the personal commitment, especially when you have to cover such a wide continent and so many countries. So I'm Portuguese, which effectively means that Africa is very close to us. I grew up surrounded by people that lived, were born, were working. I had family in Africa, so Africa has always been very close to me. Having said that, professionally, I only started covering Africa in 2013.
So just tell me a little bit about your background. I often think in assessing people in business, it's interesting to know what the influences were early in their life. But what about your parents and your forebears?
Yes, so being Portuguese, that means Africa is very close to us. And it's actually been quite a nice surprise going around East and West Africa. And when I say I'm Portuguese, it's actually helpful because it's not one of those big countries that used to be in the continent as a colonizer. We have been colonizers in Africa, the Portuguese, but it's a very small country. And so it actually helped, in a sense, my professional efforts in Africa over the last 5 years. But it also means that I'm doing something that I have lived with my whole life, and that helps. That makes you delivering, I believe, a more convincing product when you are out there in New York or London selling African stories. And that's effectively what I do. So that is very helpful.
What drives you in business?
I think it's being impactful. This may sound somewhat surprising to a lot of people. Now, these days people say bankers this, bankers that. But I actually believe being a banker and an investment banker in particular is a very good way of being very impactful in the countries I deal with. Why do I say that? Because effectively what we do is we bring capital to those countries. Can be to the governments, can be to the banks, to the corporates, or individuals. And I am a firm believer that the most transformational element in life is capital. And access to capital is what makes a difference. So as an investment banker, I believe we actually have we are making a significant contribution to bring capital from parts of the world where there are enormous pools of capital that are looking for good returns and for opportunities for growth, and bring that capital into areas like Africa, emerging markets in general, but Africa in particular, where you have plenty of opportunities, plenty of growth opportunities, but you need capital to achieve those. that's really how I see my job, and is very rewarding, I would say.
And I'll say that Africa is certainly a continent crying out for capital right now. How difficult are you finding that job in the current climate? I mean, some of the people I've been speaking to today at the World Economic Forum, they were saying that a lot of people are a lot more cautious now than they were even 2 years ago.
Yes. I would say, when you deal with emerging markets, and this is not specific to Africa, but with emerging markets, it's always up and down. It's volatile. It's in its own nature. The thing is, it's volatile, but in an upward trend. And Africa is pretty much like that. What I would say is that more recently, those windows have become smaller, but more periodic. And so you have to have a very good timing to go out in the market and attract capital, because tomorrow some geopolitical event kind of closes down markets, and and you are a company in Kenya, you have nothing to do with that, and all of a sudden you cannot refinance your bond, or you cannot execute your IPO in Nigeria because of that. So if anything, I would say in the last 2-3 years, the need to be ready to go to market is bigger than before. And that's what we have been seeing companies is get ready, and then you action the transaction if and when is possible. But I don't think there is lack enthusiasm on Africa. So I'm an optimistic in that perspective. I see the main drivers still there, obviously with challenges, and we can discuss that if you want.
Okay, and some of the challenges that maybe concern you the most at this particular time?
Yes. So I think most of the challenges when it comes to Africa are related to the macro aspect. And by macro aspect, I mean the macroeconomic management of some of those countries. We have seen in the last few years some significant devaluations, some significant issues with taking money out, and money will only flow into Africa if investors believe, if for some reason they need to get out, they can get out. And so those are the main challenges, are macroeconomic and sort of macro policies and macro politics. The good thing about Africa is the micro, is the companies, the entrepreneurs, the people, the markets. That is where Africa gets a premium, because you have no other place in the world with the same demographic dynamics and the same opportunities, resources, space, water, anything. So when you're out there selling an African IPO, it's always a debate between the macro challenges and the micro opportunities. And sometimes, it goes one way, sometimes it goes the other way.
So give us an idea of returns. I mean, obviously you deal with investments in Europe, you deal with a lot of investments in Africa. Can you give us an idea the perhaps better returns you can get for taking risks in Africa than maybe you can in Europe? Just give us a rough idea.
Yes. So what really matters is the trade-off, risk-return, as you're hinting to. To invest in Africa, when you do an analysis to invest in Africa, you will always require a higher return than investing in Europe or the US, or even most of Asia. That's a fact in the market. It's priced in the market. But can you achieve those higher returns? Generally speaking, I would say yes. And that's why investors are still coming into Africa. Just this year, we have done several IPOs. Network International, which is 25% of the business is in Africa. We have done Airtel Africa. We have done Jumia, and we believe we'll still be doing another one this year. And so if we are doing this, it's because investors still believe there is opportunities. Now, because it is more volatile, it is a bit of a more aggressive trade-off risk-return. You also need a longer period of time, typically, to see the investment bearing fruit.
So do you think at this particular time, you think investors have got the appetite for, everyone always says long term, long term, long term. Do you think the kind of investors you're dealing with, they're saying 20, 30 years, have you got that kind of mentality?
As well, but not necessarily. I think people are prepared to have shorter time horizons. What is also very important is to have an investment, there must be a seller and a buyer. The investor is the buyer, but there must be a willing seller. And the willing seller is one that is reasonable in his or her expectations. And so part of having a successful deal is also bringing these two together at a price that everybody feels it's a good deal. Now, very often we see anywhere around the world deals not happening because the seller has too rosy expectations. And that's also part of our job in managing those expectations.
And how tough can that job be sometimes?
It can be very tough.
Really?
Be very, very tough. But if you look, oversimplifying a bit, but in Africa you tend to deal with entrepreneurs rather than with large corporates. And so you tend to deal with the founder of the company, the person that developed it, and he or she has seen the company going from nothing to a very sizable company. That person will have a different view, and at the end of the day, it will be more realistic than a company where you have a whole layer of professionals having their own opinions. Tends to be more concentrated, and my experience tells me it is easier in Africa than elsewhere.
You think so? Is that the story that you take out to produce? That's the pitch that you take out to investors.
Yes, definitely. And in emerging markets and in Africa in particular, I think the stories, when you're selling a story, it's a lot more personalized than in many other places, because it tends to be sort of smaller companies, younger companies, and so understanding the journey and buying into the person that has developed that is more critical, because the growth in the future is actually more important than elsewhere. And so you really buy into personal stories when it comes to Africa, I would say more than anywhere else.
We're going to talk a lot more about the continent and other geopolitical issues in the second half. I'm speaking to Miguel Azevedo, the head of Citi Investment Bank. Do stay with us for the second half. Hello, I'm Chris Bishop and you're watching Captains of Industry. I'm talking to Miguel Azevedo, the head of Citi Investment Bank that operates here in Africa and also in Dubai. Thank you very much for joining us on this. Now, just like to sort of go a bit wider here at the moment, looking across the continent. I'd like to know where your investment hotspot. I've seen you saying a lot about Ethiopia. You think it's one of the coming places. Ethiopia and Rwanda, always two countries that are tossed around by economists when they talk about the continent.
Yes.
Where is your investment guide for this?
I think at the end of the day, the big economies will always be the top economies in terms of attracting investment. So I think the three big large engines of Africa are Egypt, Nigeria, South Africa. So that goes nearly without saying. If you ask me in terms of countries that are more new to the investment scene and that are attracting more interest versus the past, I would definitely put Ethiopia in there. I think I would put Angola in there as well. Rwanda as well, but Rwanda has been around for some time as a very interesting case study. But yes, in terms of two new investment destinations where I see a lot of interest and a lot of companies coming to us, I would highlight Ethiopia and Angola.
What do you think Ethiopia is doing right now to turn the economy around in a very short space of time?
Yes, no, I think they, on one hand, is a very big country. It's 100 million people. That creates a dynamic of its own. You know, I've mentioned before politics and policies. I think Ethiopia is doing a lot of good stuff there. It's becoming a lot more transparent. It's becoming, or they have been in the past few years, focused on developing infrastructure. So they have pretty decent infrastructure that can facilitate exports. They are becoming self-sufficient in power, in fact, an exporter of power. So they have done a bit of the plumbing before. And so they are in a good position. And I see a lot of interest, and I see they are now going into privatizations. They are attracting private investment into the telecom sector, potentially in the future into banking. I believe that will be the case, and there is a need for that. So that's what I really like in Ethiopia.
And countries like Rwanda, I mean, they're making tremendous strides in ease and speed of setting up business and doing business there. I know it has an advantage that it's very small, it's easy to control, but what do you think they're doing that other countries could learn from?
I think they're being very pragmatic, very focused, very marketing driven. I think the head of state that I have seen more times in my whole life, is not only in Africa, is President Kagame. I've seen him in investment forums in Europe, in Africa, in the US, in Asia. So they have been very focused on attracting investment and explaining why people should come to Rwanda, and it's all about ease of doing business. Very transparent, very simple, very fast. I think a lot of countries could learn from that. Having said that, it's a relatively small country and a relatively small economy.
And certainly a very pragmatic country when it comes to dealing with things, as you say. I mean, from the politicians, we hear a lot on this continent, people saying, no, we must take politics out of business, we must leave business to thrive and flourish and leave it alone, shall we say. But I mean, sometimes that's just talk, you know, and there's not enough action happening for many of the business people here.
Well, there's definitely a role for governments in building the infrastructure, whether it's hard or soft infrastructure. And I think Rwanda has done well in that respect. I've just mentioned Ethiopia. And that's where I think governments need to focus, is on one hand, building the infrastructure that can help business. On the other hand, building what I would call the legal infrastructure, the rule of law, the regulation, and then let private initiative, let companies do the business. So I'm on that side. I'm a believer of less government is better than more government, but government has its own role, and it's very needed. And I think, you know, some countries are closer to this perspective than others.
Well, a Ugandan president once said to me that it's easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than it is to take government out of business, but perhaps he was just jesting. But essentially, what are the positive signs you see on the continent that things are changing? I mean, things are happening now. That I was just talking to somebody earlier this morning at the World Economic Forum saying that they're going to have sprinklers in fields in Angola operated from Brazil because of these undersea cables. I mean, you would never have dreamt of that. I mean, what are the things that are encouraging you about the economy and its striving for growth?
I think the key thing I see is entrepreneurial spirit. And that is what is driving change in the continent. And that together with technology itself, some of it developed here, some of it imported, is helping leapfrogging some of the problems that the continent as in terms of infrastructure. So I'm very positive in everything that has to do with technology, with financial technology, fintech, because with telecoms, with e-commerce, with mobile financial services, because that's where I see the legacy of the past being less relevant and the opportunity being to develop a new economy and leapfrogging all the problems from the past. You've mentioned agri. There's a lot of tech happening in agri. There's a lot of tech happening in financial inclusion. And that is, I think I've mentioned this point before, access to capital is critical to make this whole continent achieve another level. Because you can be very entrepreneurial, you can be very creative, but if you don't have capital, nothing will happen. And I see technology playing an enormous role in distributing capital. And I see investors from around the world extremely excited, i.e. keen on pouring capital into these players.
What role does Dubai play in all of this in terms of funneling capital towards the emerging markets?
Not really. I'm based in Dubai because I also had the Middle East activities for sitting in investment banking. Dubai is very well connected into Africa, so from a logistical standpoint, is actually used quite a lot. Middle East countries and Middle East corporates are investing more and more in Africa, but I wouldn't say that Dubai is more important than London or New York. I don't think that is the case.
Okay, what particular changes would you like to see in the way the economies of Africa are run to try to ignite this flow of capital?
I would mention 2 or 3 points. One is interest rates are very high in Africa, and that is a tremendous drag on investment. Anyone that borrows will have to pay 15% interest rate. That is partially due to the fact that governments are borrowing a lot of money and they are crowding out private investment. So if governments reduce the amount of borrowing, they will leave more resources for the private initiative to invest. So I would say that is one. Second, I think business would improve and would benefit from a higher level of predictability in government policies. And where we have that predictability, and we have mentioned the case of Rwanda, I think it's a great example of predictability. People know what they can expect. For business, that is absolutely critical. And the third element, I would say, is investing more in education. And that will probably require having a better tax collection system around the continent. But that can take us to a different conversation.
What about public-private partnerships? It's a very fashionable phrase at the moment. It's seen as an answer to a lot of the continent's infrastructure problems. How do you see them playing out?
I think it can play a very important role. I think having private initiative and private capital is critical. Governments do not have the capital to attack this problem at the speed that it is required. I think having a public-private partnership will allow for capital to come in from all over the world. It will also, I believe, improve the level of execution, having private initiative. I would say, however, that can only be properly effective and beneficial for a country if the government is able to create a regulation framework around it that ensures that the risk-return trade-off is balanced and it's not skewed towards the private initiative, which has happened elsewhere. So overall, I think it's a good tool and should be used to accelerate the investment that is so much needed.
So finally, I mean, what is your, looking to the future now, what is your hope for this continent as a business person operating up and down? What sort of hope do you take from this continent?
I'm very hopeful, very optimistic. And the more I interact with African entrepreneurs, African corporates, African banks, the more excited I get. There's so much to be done. There's so much capacity to execute. I just hope that the macro environment becomes a bit more of an enabler to business and to the well-being of societies.
Well, thank you very much. That's Miguel Azevedo, the head of City Investment Bank. And that's all we have time for on this edition of Captains of Industry from the Cullinan Hotel here in Cape Town. From me, Chris Bishop, it's goodbye.